I'm not qualified to talk about this game. I'm out of my depth when I play most traditional 3D fighting games. I haven't even played Tobal 2 with another person yet. But I refuse to let another year pass without getting this video out. So, in spite of the fact that all I can offer is a novice's take on how Tobal 2 seems to operate, I'm going to press on and do my best to try and cover it as thoroughly as possible. Tobal number 1 and Tobal 2 both have reputations for being ahead of their time, partially because they both have features which appeared over time in other fighters over the years, and partially because some of the staff went on to work in other development teams. I've spent roughly 2 years learning the ins and outs of different 3D fighters, and I can say that those reputations seem to be valid, more or less. As Squaresoft's first foray into fighting games in general, and as a console-based fighting game in particular, that is to say, it was made with consoles in mind rather than arcades, Tobal number 1 was an interesting experiment. The controls made move properties a bit more universal by divvying up even the most basic attacks into high, mid, and low strikes, rather than setting attacks to specific limbs or generalizing them with levels of strengths. And guarding and jumping were mapped to separate buttons as well, most likely to make movement simpler. The single-player portion was fleshed out with Quest Mode, which built a dungeon crawling system around the fighting mechanics, and said Quest Mode was the main way to unlock characters to be used, as the bosses would become playable once they were defeated. I think it's safe to say that such things were novel ideas back in 1996, and while they were made because of the consistency that a console provides, there was no guarantee that it would have made up for the support that arcades were still capable of providing in the mid-90s. In that context, it's easy to see why Squaresoft padded their bets by bundling Japanese and North American copies of Tobal number 1 with early demos of Final Fantasy VII and other promo goodies. PAL territories were left out in the cold as usual, since they got Tobal number 1 sans demo at the same time Final Fantasy VII was released in Japan, and yet those same territories didn't get Final Fantasy VII until nearly a year later. And yet, despite Squaresoft's sterling track record on publishing the first game, their involvement was mainly as a co-developer and producer. They absolutely contributed a lot to the overall look and feel of the first game, don't get me wrong. I'm pretty sure they're the ones who got Akira Toriyama to handle the character designs, for example. But there were a handful of other companies which were hired as workhorses for most of the game's development. CGI teams, separate QA staff, heck, they even got Japan Action Club, which was a popular stunt agency at the time, to do some motion capture. Out of all of these other teams, Dream Factory was the company that contributed the most to the game design. Founded by Saiichi Ishii in '95, the company worked on or co-developed a few games with Squaresoft over the years. Apart from the Tobal series, they also worked on Air Gaze and went on to make The Bouncer. And they also had a stint as a workhorse company for other developers and production houses before fading into relative obscurity. Ishii himself had quite a bit of experience with fighting games up to that point, having worked as a coordinator for the original Virtua Fighter, a director for the arcade and PS1 versions of Tekken 1 and the arcade version of Tekken 2, and as a designer for the combat of all three games. And he was the main game designer and director for the Tobal series. The same could be said of some of his employees, such as Hitoshi Matsuda, Hanae Karasawa, and Makoto Morishita, who all worked on Tekken at one point or another, or Takashi Suzuki, who made the model system program for the first Virtua Fighter game. And the staff also featured someone who was still cutting their teeth on fighting games, Toru Ikebuchi, who had worked as the main programmer on Virtua Fighter 2, Virtua Fighter Kids, and as a programmer on Virtua Fighter 3, in between acting as main programmer and design manager for both Tobal games, before directing Virtua Fighter 4 and supervising Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution. Now, I don't mean to imply that Tobal number 1 was some sort of heavy-hitting dream team of devs or anything. In fact, a lot of the people I just mentioned haven't worked on anything huge in ages, and others haven't worked in the industry at all since the mid-2000s for that matter. But some of them did trickle out into other companies, and have worked on other games since then, and they cut their teeth on Tobal number 1, under the supervision of a director who was part of the early boom of 3D fighters. That's why I'd also say it's safe to assume that Ishii knew exactly what he was doing when he laid out the game design for both Tobal No. 1 and Tobal 2 in the manner that he chose to. As someone who worked on Virtua Fighter, he knew what it would take to make a convincing 3D space, and made the necessary changes to allow characters to move in that space at the same standards that arcade games stuck to, such as going with flat shapes and flat shading in order to lock in a steady 60 frames per second. And yet, as someone who put more time in on the Tekken series, he also set up a system which moved away from the rock, paper, scissors style of inputs that Virtua Fighter embraces, and towards something along the lines of Tekken, where there are always multiple factors and actions to take into account in a situation. And even then, allowances were made within the game's design for the players, so that they would not have to rely on such nuances if they didn't really get into it at that point. In other words, he went his own way with the first Tobal game, and it becomes more apparent when you look at how the game changed from Tobal No. 1 to Tobal 2. When Tobal 2 was being made, Squaresoft took a more hands-off approach, opting to stick to the production side of things. Dream Factory had a bigger stake in the development of the game, and as they made this sequel, they took the opportunity to make some changes instead of going with more of the same. They moved away from the industrial look and illustrations that the first game employed, and made some sweeping changes to the music, but the animation and gameplay received a huge overhaul. The modelers ditched the flat, polygonal models and wireframe trailing effects for more rounded figures and lots of particles and sparkles, reworked the grab attacks, and even added fireballs for good measure. This did introduce some slowdown, but I guess they figured fireballs were worth it. And the things that surrounded the gameplay were fleshed out. 2 more main characters were added. Tobal 2's quest mode had better dungeon design and more monsters than the previous games. And the link between the versus mode and the quest mode was strengthened even further by the fact that you could capture creatures or unlock characters in quest mode and then use them in versus mode. Some of them even had move lists that could measure up to most of the characters from the main roster. Again, I must stress that I'm not trying to hype up these improvements. The quest mode was still pretty repetitive and some of the character unlocks were convoluted, but decisions such as these show where the team's priorities were. And I'm not really a single player type of guy. I prefer talking about the versus mode and such. But because of the way that Tobal's single player and versus mode kinda smashed together, I had to at least give some lip service to the former before I delve into the latter. So, the way I see it, there are 2 things about Tobal's combat in general that makes the series stand out in comparison to its peers in the genre at the time. The way it handled movement, and how grapples were handled. The movement is obvious in motion. Characters could circle around each other at a solid trot, and dashing and running could carry one clear across the stage in a few seconds. They'd even skid to a stop after a forward run, or trip over themselves during an extended backdash. Even the camera would bolt across its axis from time to time, although thankfully that was adjusted into Tobal 2's versus mode. Most fighting games at the time stuck to tense, slow walk speeds, short, guarded dashes, and heavy, flat-footed charges. Heck, the same can be said for most 3D fighting games nowadays. So this is definitely a big change of pace, and I can see why people take to it when they see how the characters move about. The throw system, on the other hand, was more nuanced. Tobal built off of the simple high-low 2-button grab system that most 3D fighters used at the time, and threw in a handful of different attacks and guards that chained from one standing grapple, which players would go into whether they were grabbed standing up or crouching. In most instances amongst the main cast, this grapple gave them universal options of either striking their opponent, pushing them away, or throwing them. Characters could strike an opponent high with a punch or low with a kick. 3 repeated strikes in a row would stun, while 2 strikes at different angles could also stun different characters. A push would push an opponent away, as the name implies, and a throw could be added to either a strike or a push, so long as the opponent is still within a fighter's grasp. The sole exceptions to this setup are grabs attempted from the side or from behind, or character-specific options and limitations. Mary, for example, has a much wider range of grabs than most of the other characters, and Il can only be thrown from behind via giant swing, and can only escape such a situation by doing the same to others. And the game makes sure that both players are active participants in this struggle. The player on the offensive could punch or kick, and the player being grabbed could guard either type of attack with a directional press unless they mashed it out. The former could throw the latter, but the latter could escape or even reverse the throw. And the former could escape or reverse the reversal. Player 1 can chain a high strike or a low strike together and get an instant dizzy, but that made it easier to guess how to block the first or second hit. They could stagger the hits or push the opponent around, but that left them open for a reversal or escape attempt. They could start a juggle, but the timing could very well push the opponent out of range. It's a constant back and forth, where very few situations are altogether guaranteed. There's a lot of ways that this could have been fouled up. It could have been turned into a mini-game, or reduced to a rock-paper-scissors type of mini-match, but all of those issues were sidestepped. It's not just a matter of, oh, I thought you picked option 1 of 2, but you picked option 2 of 2 instead. There's a lot of options, each of which contains an appropriate amount of risk and reward, and which also seems to require reading your opponent in extended play. It could be said that by making these things universal, or by removing an immediate pass-fail for the throws, or by not including a low throw, the throwing aspect of the game is diminished. But I think the novelty and effectiveness of all of these options, and how different characters can make use of them, makes up for it. And although some aspects of this throw system have worked their ways into other games, due in no small part to the fact that a lot of devs who worked on these games moved on to other companies, no other traditional fighting game has quite the same system as this. And I think it's worth noting that wrestling games, which make their bread and butter on their throw mechanics, or just by being a part of a long-standing series regardless of their actual quality, are the only games that have grapples that are at least as good as this, if not better. To have a system as good as this which still manages to complement the rest of the game rather than override it is impressive. It's these elements that set the series apart from its peers in the genre, at least in my mind. But on a similar note, it's the other stuff, the stuff that they put a spin on, that's more of a stumbling block. There are, for instance, projectiles in this game. There's a universal command for them, and all of the main characters have one. Now that's unusual enough as it is. Projectile attacks in 3D games are usually a rarity, and typically only go to boss characters. Now, these projectiles cost health. They're unblockable. Most of them track the opponent at startup and release, and they can be held onto as long as you have enough health to keep the attack going, although there's a steep dip in power after a few seconds. It's definitely an interesting idea, and acts as another example of the single-player and versus aspects of the game being intertwined, as the attack is quite useful in quest mode, but it doesn't gel as well as the other things I've mentioned so far. It's useful against people who don't know how it works, and on early enemies in quest mode, but it's a toss-up against people who do know how it works, and somewhat of a detriment in the later stages of the quest. That's probably why I've seen people phase it out of their general game plan after they've figured it out. It's a shame too. I wouldn't be surprised if the team worked them into the game just because they had Toriyama working on the character design. The way juggles were handled in Tobal 2 was more reasonable, I think. They operate off of 2 stages. The initial launch, which puts the opponent in a limited juggle state, and the second launcher hit, which causes a much looser and goofier looking flipping juggle state. Weight and size still matter in both stages, but at the same time, the second state adds a bit of consistency to an otherwise uneven distribution of height amongst the roster. When a character hits that second juggle state, you don't aim for their core or legs to keep a combo going. Instead, you gauge their rate of descent and eyeball whether you can get close enough to tag on more hits. Another notable mode in Tobal 2 is the training mode. I don't usually talk about training modes much because it's pretty hard to mess up that feature. Usually, if it has a way to make the dummy attack while standing in place, or a way for the player to record inputs that the dummy can use, it's fine by me, either or, although some games don't even offer that much. Tobal 2 is fantastic in that regard, as it offers so many options, even if some of them are kind of frivolous. For example, if you want to get the timing down for a particularly difficult combo, you can actually slow down the game in this mode so that you can use the animation of the models to sort out the timing, rather than just figuring out a controlled way to mash it out or sorting out a kind of rhythm for it. By slowing the game down, you can figure out the exact time that a move has to be put in before it can register. It also features a frame counter, which shows the active frame of any given attack. This can be useful when it's applied to figuring out the properties of an attack. If you want to practice grappling, you can set up training modes so that the dummy is completely focused on guarding strikes, or practice your reversals, or even set the training dummy to use the same controller inputs as your character, in order to practice against your own throws. And you can edit the colors on the character's costumes too. Nowadays, this sort of thing would be considered secondary to a good old-fashioned spreadsheet with frame data, and stuff like frame-by-frame slowdown would be seen as an admission of the inherently player-hostile nature of frame-specific moves, and the lack of skin tones on the clothing would be taken as proof that Squaresoft's being a wet blanket, and so on and so forth. But this training mode just blasts past the bar that was set for most fighters in the 90s, and although some of these features have seeped through to other games, they should be coupled together in competent training modes more often. These features allow players to focus on each aspect of the gameplay in a manner that's almost as good as having a training buddy to play with. As much as I dislike playing top trumps with facts, the Tobal series lives up to its reputation as games ahead of their time, and Tobal 2 definitely fleshes out all the stuff that its predecessor introduced. I just wish I could have found someone to play this game with in person. I wouldn't feel like I was talking out of my backside if I actually played a few matches against real people. But at least now I can stop having cringe attacks over the fact that I took so long to make this video. And for what it's worth, I didn't spend all of my time frozen in space, thinking back to embarrassments of my youth, with my heart filled with shame and my lungs aching for air. Nope, I've been amassing a collection of games. And after my Plasma Sword video is finished, I'll be taking a good look at the output of other workhorse studios which I'm sure you've come to know and love. And I'll also cover some Dimps games while I'm at it. Although I don't know whether public opinion on those has improved or declined after they stopped working on the Street Fighter IV series. But I'll be sure not to give a specific time frame for those, since that's what tripped me up the last time. Meanwhile, I'm off to go compose a music intro, because public domain music is complicated stuff and I'm tired of cold opens. Later.